So Happy is not an environmental film per se. So why then are we watching it? Lately I've been thinking about what may be the greatest irony of the human race. If we do not survive the climate crisis, it may be a sad epitaph for our species. From even before Plato, thinkers in the West have long pondered what constitutes the good life. In the United States, we have been preoccupied with the question ever since we declared ourselves an independent country and made the pursuit of happiness one of those three unalienable rights in our Declaration of Independence. So, what now constitutes the good life in the U.S.? In other words, how are we pursuing happiness? The American dream now seems to center on wanting more, wanting bigger, and wanting better. More stuff, bigger houses, better cars. You get the idea. The problem is this has not at all made us happy. In fact, in recent decades, Americans have become less and less happy. While this would be a sad irony in itself, the greatest irony is that many of these pursuits are destroying our planet. Americans put nearly a quarter of all greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Indeed, at the same time that Americans have been becoming less happy, we have been pumping more and more greenhouses into our planet's atmosphere. What is in many ways even worse is that we are now exporting this environmentally disastrous aspect of the American way of life to the rest of the planet. It would be one thing if we were releasing greenhouse gases into the atmosphere for more noble reasons, such as to ensure that everyone on the planet received enough to eat. But this is not the case, and this is all largely unnecessary. I mean, really, do we need 60 or more items of new clothing every year for every American? In short, we have frenetically and futilely been pursuing happiness at the cost of the planet. As I noted above, the great irony is that as greenhouse gas emissions soared as a result of our pursuit of happiness, our happiness has actually declined. So here is my question. Are we indeed destroying our planet in a profoundly misguided pursuit of happiness? In order to wrestle with this question, let's look at happiness compared to greenhouse gas emissions for a number of pretty happy countries. First, it's true. After many decades of studying depression and unhappiness, a range of scholars, from psychologists to sociologists, have recently turned their attention to happiness, as has the United Nations. The United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network, using Gallup poll data, released the World Happiness Report in 2019. The report revealed that the United States ranked number 19 worldwide in terms of happiness. With respect to the climate crisis, we emit about 16 metric tons of CO2 per person. Maybe as much as 20, but let's go with 16 now. Which gives us the dubious distinction of being one of the world's leaders when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. Alternately, the 5 countries with the happiest people on the planet, and this is Finland, Denmark, Norway, Iceland, and the Netherlands, all have individual emissions that are on average about half of the United States, in spite of the fact that they are all in very northern climates and hence use quite a bit of energy just for heating. In fact, a whopping 81% of Finland's greenhouse gas emissions comes from the energy sector, which is hardly surprising as the capital of Finland, Helsinki, is further north than the capital of Alaska, which of course is Juneau. In general, living in a cold climate demands far more energy than living in a warmer one, even if air conditioners are widely used in the warmer climate. One study found that living in Minnesota demanded 3.5 times more energy than living in Miami. Living in places that are even further north consumes even more energy. Energy-related carbon dioxide emissions for the average Alaskan are twice as large as the average person in the U.S. Moving from Finland to the 6th most happiest country in the world, Switzerland, average per capita greenhouse gas emissions there are 1/3 of the United States, in spite of the fact that it too is not at all a warm country. In fact, 2/3 of Switzerland are in the Alps mountain chain. Number 7 on the list of happy countries is Sweden. Also a pretty cold place. Sweden's capital, Stockholm, is also further north than Juneau, Alaska. Nonetheless, their per capita greenhouse gas emissions are approximately 1/4 of the United States. So let's pause on this. The 7 countries on the planet with the happiest people, in spite of demanding significantly greater energy use because of their northern locales, have climate footprints that are 1/2, 1/3, or 1/4 ours. The climate footprints of happy people can be even smaller if they live in warmer climates. Costa Rica, which ranks number 12 in the list of worldwide happiness. Hence, Costa Ricans are significantly happier than Americans at number 19, has greenhouse gas emissions that are about 1/7 of the United States. That's right, the average American contributes as much to the climate crisis as 7 pretty happy people in Costa Rica. The example of Costa Rica reveals an interesting element here as well, as the average American is 13 times wealthier than the average person in Costa Rica, and that's as measured by mean wealth per adult. As our relative climate footprints reveal, we Americans are presumably using quite a bit of this wealth in ways that are damaging the planet. However, with respect to income, let's face it and let's face facts. It's difficult to be happy if you are very poor. If you're trying to raise a family in the U.S. on an annual income of, say, $40,000 a year, you'll face a range of hardships that will certainly threaten your happiness. However, studies have found that beyond a certain point, more money does not bring greater happiness. That number may be lower than you would imagine, as these studies revealed that in the U.S. it's about $75,000 in annual income for an individual. While this is more than the median personal income in the U.S., it certainly is not Kardashian wealth. Moreover, no one, to my knowledge, has attempted to isolate and remove the influence of the overwhelming marketing bombarding us, which tells us daily or hourly or even minutely online that we need to buy a range of products to be happy. So let's return to the example of Costa Rica, as it reveals that, simply put, you don't need a lot of money to be happy, nor does a greater happiness necessarily come from, comparatively, a relatively high climate footprint. So now let's return to those very happy but very cold Scandinavian countries. For the most part, their economies and cultures are built on something often called the Nordic model. While these are, of course, democratic countries, they also very much embrace things like collective bargaining and strong unions. Hence, they are sometimes called democratic socialist countries. Bernie Sanders nicely explains what these countries offer. This is Sanders here. Quote, so long as we know that what democratic socialism is, if we know that in countries like in Scandinavia, like Denmark, Norway, Sweden, that they are very democratic countries, obviously they are. The voter turnout there is a lot higher than it is in the United States. In those countries, healthcare is the right of all people, and in those countries, college education, graduate education is free. In those countries, retirement benefits, childcare are stronger than in the U.S. And in those countries, by and large, government works for ordinary people in the middle class rather than, in the case now in the U.S., for the billionaire class. So, even though we might think that happiness is a deeply personal matter, and in some ways it is, governments have a major role to play in facilitating our pursuit of happiness. When they are doing their job responsibly, caring for the well-being of their citizens rather than large corporate sponsors, we are likely to be much happier. But specifically, how are people in these Scandinavian countries happier, and how does this relate to the climate crisis and to politics? Well, let's look at Sweden. Recall that the average Swede is considerably happier than the average American, even though their climate footprints are 1/4 of ours. The average person in Sweden, who makes almost as much as the average person in the U.S., works 5 days a week, 6 hours a day. That's right, the average work week in Sweden is 30 hours a week. Only a very tiny percentage of people, that's 1%, work more than 50 hours per week. By contrast, 40% of all Americans work more than 50 hours a week, and half of them work more than 60 hours per week. Hence, 1 in 5 Americans literally works twice as many hours per week as the average Swede. Everyone in Sweden receives 25 paid vacation days per year. Counting, that translates into 5 weeks. And large companies typically offer even more. All parents receive 480 days of paid paternity leave to split between them. As there are 235 working days per year, that's 52 weeks times 5 days minus 25 vacation days. That's 1 year of paternity leave per parent. There are, of course, differences between Sweden and the U.S. that impact their climate footprint. For example, Sweden currently relies more on nuclear energy than does the U.S. However, over a third of their electricity comes from hydroelectric sources, a whopping 3 times more than the U.S. In terms of consumption rather than production, we have twice as many cars per person as they do, and our houses are on average twice as large as theirs. they have. I'm not saying that life in Sweden is perfect. There are, of course, problems there, like everywhere else. But just look at the relative climate impact between Sweden and the U.S. Everything else being equal, the average Swede has a carbon footprint that's a quarter of the average American's. But everything is not equal, as it is much colder climate. Americans living in a comparable climate, Alaska, are emitting twice as many carbon dioxide or equivalent gases as an average in the nation. Hence, adjusted for their colder climate, the average Swede may well be emitting something like 1/8 of the average American's greenhouse gas emissions. Currently, the average person in Sweden is responsible for just 4.54 metric tons of CO2 per year. If, by reasons of this argument, we adjust for the average American climate, it would then get cut in half to around 2.25 metric tons of CO2 per American, which would be right around where we need to be to meet the goals of the Paris Accord signed to COP21. Of course, these are back-of-napkin calculations, but people in the developed world can, and do, not only get by, but live quite well with relatively small climate footprints. In terms of our current discussion, they can also live happier lives than most Americans. We're often told that adapting to the climate crisis will mean that we have to have drab lives of deprivation and that we're going to be required to give up quite a bit, that it's going to be a lot of hardship. However, if we make the sort of changes that we've been looking at in this course, might we be able to come out the other end, decades from now, happier? Not only with a smaller carbon footprint, not only with a sufficiently small carbon footprint, but happier. I'll leave you with this question.